Jesus said there would be wars, earthquakes, famine, and pestilence, that nation would rise against nation. There would be false Christs, signs in the heavens, and the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. The sun would be darkened, and the moon would not give its light. Men's hearts would fail them for fear. The destruction of Damascus, Gog and Magog, the rapture, the man of sin, Armageddon, nuclear war, destruction of society, genetic engineering, transhumanism, the UFO phenomena, global government, universal church, and doctrines of demons. Enter the realm of Last Days. We invite you to another exciting episode of Last Days broadcast, where we will examine current events in light of God's prophetic word. And now your host, Pastor Jerry.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Last Days broadcast. I'm your host, Pastor Jerry. We're glad you could tune in and be with us this week. And once again in our studio, we have the privilege of Joe Ardis being with us from survivalmall.com. And we're going to talk this week about survival pantries, what we need to have in our homes for long-term storage. If something were to take place, whether it's an economic meltdown, war in the Middle East, a terrorist attack, an EMP, any of these events, weather-related, tornadoes, maybe a big heavy snowfall in the winter that knocks power out for an extended period of time. Lord forbid we went through an earthquake or flooding or some type of disaster that could cause us to be without what we're normally used to having for an extended period of time. And I do believe it's important that we use wisdom in setting aside for events such as this, particularly in light of what we see going on in the world around us. We do see these things happening on a more increased scale. You can use your religious mind to qualify that with biblical statements, or just look at what's happening. Just look at the facts. And there are more of these things happening. They're more devastating. We have an increased population in the world we live in. And Joe, thank you for being with us again, brother.
It's good to be back, Pastor Jerry. Thank you for having me.
What are some of the things that we should have, Joe, for long-term storage, for long-term survival in a case of an event or a disaster?
Well, one of the things that I would like to express to your listeners is when you talk about long-term storage, a lot of people just immediately think food. But it's actually quite something more than that. And depending on the emergency, it can be quite expensive, but not terribly expensive in a lot of cases.
Okay.
One example would be, let's say that primarily on top of one of the largest earthquake faults in the United States, the Madrid. And now professionals in reaction to this Fukushima situation are saying that, and I don't know if it's just the media has drawn attention to this or the need to be concerned about our nuclear storage facilities as well as our nuclear energy facilities and things like this, and how vulnerable we might be here in the States if something were to happen here in terms of an earthquake. Because if you go back to the 80s, I remember all of the talk about the big one in California, the San Andreas, the big one. It's going to happen, the big one. Remember all that? Yes. The big one. It was on headlines and God's been gracious. We have not seen the big one. We've seen tremors, which is actually a good sign in California. It may be buying us time. But getting back to my original point, long-term storage, if something were to happen, let's say, here in the Midwest where we see an earthquake event, and let's say that we get very lucky and none of our nuclear facilities, and don't quote me on this, but I believe there's 104 here in the United States. That number may not be accurate. It may be quite off, but it's a lot of them.
Well, I know,
and they're all over the United States, yes.
I do know this. I've gone on the site when the actual disaster took place in Fukushima to see how many reactors were in it, and the map showed, like you just said, I didn't count them all, but they're literally well over 100 in this country, no question.
Right. Well, a true professional in that bin, you might actually hear those comments and say, this guy, you know what, he's nuts. We've got 120, or, you know, we've only got 92, or, you know, whatever. So the number, but the point is there's dozens of them, and they're all over the United States, and I think there's at least 6 on the Madrid. So let's say we get very lucky, and none of those are compromised during an earthquake. That still might mean that roads are shut down, supermarkets have no food because the people that live there locally have gone there in a panic and procured everything that they have. Where food is available, the prices are way up because the private store owners are either taking advantage of the civilians, or their cost on it is so extreme that they have to pass those costs on to the people that live there locally. I mean, there's a trillion ways to imagine how what we've seen based on just our own history here in the States, as well as what we're seeing in the world around us when you get outside the U.S., how, you know, there are such things as shortages. We're seeing shortages here in the U.S., and I can share a little bit about that here in terms of the long-term storage food here in just a minute. But let's assume that we somehow sidestep all of our nuclear facilities being compromised. Still, again, there could be all sorts of other ways for dangerous particles to be in the atmosphere and being carried up above. And you may need to do what we refer to as sheltering in place. This is, now, in our last broadcast, we kind of talked about the grab-and-go bucket, the design of being able to grab and go with a grab bag or a carry bag, okay? The idea that you're going to take a bag full of supplies and you're going to take your family or yourself as the individual is going to take off on the road, or you're going to try to get somewhere else outside of where you think the emergency situation is happening. But let's assume that in this scenario, it's too dangerous to go outside. You've got rioters, you've got looting. Yes, you're basically, you have to stay at home. It's dangerous to leave the house. Maybe this is not about food riots or shortages or violence on the streets. Maybe this is a scenario where simply going outside, you're exposing yourself to radiological bacteria that are going to kill you. Okay. In those cases, you may have a situation where you need to do what's called sheltering in place. So when you say long-term storage, long-term storage.
In other words, let me clarify that for our listeners as well as for you. What I mean by that is, you know, we've seen in Katrina, by experience, that when something takes place, such as a flood or hurricane or any of these events, or it could be a terrorist attack, you put the tag on it. Our stores seem to run out of everything within days or up to just a week. In other words, there are those, I had a cousin that was living there at the time, and a week after the event, you cannot buy basic staple items from your store simply because they're not there. They're gone. There's been a run on it. And, you know, most of us as Americans tend to live out of our grocery stores. We have them right down the street. If you live in a suburban environment, you cannot go get basic needs to keep yourself alive if they're not there. And of course, so we should have a supply of that on hand at home to get us through that period of time. Now, I'll tell our listeners this. Many of you know that I work in the printing industry, and for many years I worked for a man. It's been several years now. He was at that time a Mormon bishop. Of course, he and I didn't see eye to eye on theology, but one of the things the Mormon church that he taught his people, and I believe it was mandatory within their particular faith, is that they needed to have a year's worth of food on supply at all times. In other words, to be in good standing. Now, of course, we don't legislate that in our church or tell people what they ought to do, but I thought that was a good idea because of just simply the times we live in. I don't know if many of you are old enough to remember the Y2K situation. Of course, that's when I first became aware of setting things aside. I was just like most Americans. When I need something, I go to the store and I get it. But let's play the what-if scenario. What if something happens or a disaster takes place and you and I cannot get what we need? What are we going to do? What are we going to do? You'll see crime go up. I'll give you a clue as to what I'm going to ask you in the second half of the broadcast, but we'll see crime go up. We'll see goods become scarce. maybe you are better off sheltering in place. What should we have in our pantry? What goods will last long enough to get us through? In other words, something that will stay on the shelf for several years, not several months.
A couple of things that are the real obvious things that people should have on hand is some way to either purify water, and I'm not going to go into every little thing. There's a lot of information, and by the way, for your listeners, there's a lot of free information at survivormall.com. If people go there, there's a link on the left-hand side that's called free downloads, and we want you to have this information. It's why we offer it free. You can download an entire PDF with pages and pages and pages of information on exactly what Pastor Jerry and I are talking about.
Let me stop you right there, Joe. I'm an old guy, so when I get a thought, I have to act on it or it'll go from me and I'll never remember it again. But you were talking about purifying water and keeping water. Water is obviously the number one need for human life. And in a disaster, you need to have water set aside or the ability to purify it so that you can drink it. Now, yes. In a kit, in my particular 72-hour bag, I have what's called a Katahdin filter that I use along with water purification tablets, kind of a 1-2 punch there. I can draw water on the go, even out of a mud puddle if I need to. I notice you guys over at Survivor Mall sell what's called a Berkeley filtration system. That would be something that would be excellent to have at home, would it not?
Absolutely. We have a number of water purification devices. Berkey tends to be one of the larger, more popular type items. In other words, you filter with a Berkey, you can filter 3 to 6 to 8 gallons of water at a time. Where some of the smaller Aquamira type devices are smaller. These are filter straws. They're going to do essentially the same kind of thing. They're going to filter out not nuclear waste or nuclear hazards, but they will filter out molds, parasites, algae, bacteria. So you could essentially take, even if you ran completely out of water and it was safe to actually go outside, but let's say the city is not providing your water. They've shut it off for some governmental reason, or the power to your home or to the city or wherever your water pump is located is shut off. But you can find a creek, let's say even a mud puddle.
Right.
A mud puddle. You could take water out of that mud puddle and purify it to drink. As green and as stale as it looks, you can purify it to drink with an Aquamira or a Berkey. And the Aquamiras are smaller, and smaller units. You can get them for less than $20. These would have been, these are fantastic for people that are in a situation like Hurricane Katrina, where they end up on top of the roofs of their homes. Absolutely. And there's water everywhere, but it's contaminated with all sorts of, molds and parasites and bacteria. So, is that what you mean?
Exactly. You just answered my question there. That's wonderful. Let me ask you this, Joe. What about storage of food items such as canned foods? What about freeze-dried foods? And Joe, what would be the difference between storing freeze-dried and/or canned foods, pro and con?
Well, there's nothing wrong with storing canned foods. In fact, we've come to know over the last few years a number of people that actually store canned foods, and what they'll do is they'll buy a 1-year supply of food that they rotate. So let's say they've got green beans. They buy them at Costco. They have a 3-month expiration. You and I both privately would probably eat those and not think twice about doing it up to 9 months later, but let's just say that you follow the dates. So every 3 months, you go back and you buy what you need to eat for that week or 2 weeks, but you use the product that's sitting at the front of your rotation. So when you're adding food to your pantry or your basement or wherever you're storing the food, you're always adding to the back of it, so you're rotating through your stock. So there's that initial investment of buying groceries from your grocery store, where you're going to have to invest that initial clump of investment. But then after that, it's kind of a residual payoff. You're just, as long as you can stay committed to that. You got to be organized to make it work. But you put food in from the back, and you take the older food that you've had for a few weeks, and that's what you eat.
So a good rule of thumb is to store what you actually eat.
Yes, store what you're planning to eat. Things like rice, green beans, vegetables, and do it as often as possible by the number 10 can. Number 10 cans tend to be what restaurants use, and you can buy these things at places like Sam's Club or Costco. That is probably the fastest consumer route to getting what isn't technically considered long-term storage foods, but could be used for a few months if managed correctly.
Now, the freeze-dried, obviously you would need water to hydrate, correct?
Yes, you need some variation of purified water or sealed water packets. We did talk about the Berkey and the ways of purifying water. The only kryptonite, the only hole in purifying water on your own that some people forget to take into account is if you do have nuclear fallout, poisonous particles or mercury, things like this floating through the air. That may not be something that a Berkey is certified to filter. This is with a Berkey or an Aquamira. These are going to be units that are certified to filter bacteria, pathogens, parasites, things like that. When you get into unknown chemical agents, let's say somebody releases to the public for the first time a chemical, a terrorist, releases to the public something we've never seen before that's a chemical agent. You may not want to rely on your water purification tablets or your Berkey to filter that out. So in that case, you may want U.S. Coast Guard approved long-term storage water, which we also have at survivormall.com. And those are units of purified water, but they're sealed. So they've never been exposed to the air. They've never been exposed to the air. They don't become exposed until you crack one open. So the water inside is fine.
And you can get that either in cans or packets, I would assume.
By the case?
By the case?
Or by the packet, yes. The ones we carry come in two forms. We have an aqua block, which looks very much like a treetop apple juice you might send with your child on their way to school. We also have the Mainstay brand, which is more of an aluminum packaging. It looks more like a Capri Sun without a straw.
I got you.
But either way, that's
something that's good to have in the pantry. It really does.
And it's going to double as a way if you're really desperate and you don't have a way to purify natural water from outside or from a mud puddle or from a creek for your long-term storage foods. You can rehydrate your long-term storage food if you go on the freeze-dried route with your packages of sealed water.
Well, that sounds like a good thing, a wonderful thing. We're going to take a break right now, and when we return, more with Joe Ardis from survivormall.com. Don't go away.
Could you feed your family from your own garden for a year or more if you had to? Would you know the right kind of seeds to choose? Would you have enough seeds to plant a survival garden for the following year? Hi, I'm Nita Horn, encouraging you to check out Heirloom Organics non-hybrid seeds, available now at survivormall.com. With Heirloom Organic seeds, growing your own survival garden becomes easy. Be assured Heirloom Organic seeds are not hybrid or genetically modified in any way. You can save your harvest seeds from this year and have more than enough to plant next year. You never have to buy seeds again. This is not possible with hybrid or genetically modified seeds. Now you can grow your own survival garden for a bountiful, healthy, all-natural harvest anywhere in the country. Heirloom Organics, available now at www.survivormall.com.
Available now on patiobooks.com.
One email, 5 lines, 4,000 dead, and it's only just beginning. A small boy in Iowa forwards a mysterious email from God to a small group of friends. Within hours, blood flows on the streets of his quiet farm community. Thousands more are dead across the country in dozens of simultaneous terror attacks. The government blames fundamentalists who want to trigger the apocalypse, but the evidence points back to someone inside the government. FBI agent Joe Eunice reluctantly teams with a conspiracy-minded internet radio host to expose the plot and discovers that the enemy is not of flesh and blood. The God Conspiracy by Derek P. Gilbert from PID Publishing. Available in trade paperback as an ebook for Acrobat Reader and Amazon.com's Kindle ebook reader, and now as a free audiobook at www.patiobooks.com.
We now return to the Last Days broadcast. Here is Pastor Jerry.
Well, we're back now with Joe Ardis from Survivor Mall. We're glad that you could be with us again, Joe. Thanks so much for stopping by. We really appreciate the information that you've been giving us. Now, I do have a question for you, Joe.
Yes.
As it relates to survivormall.com and any other survival website and I know you're not responsible for that, but we'll see items like stun guns, pepper spray. A lot of people get excited. They say, hey man, what are they trying to promote over there? But one of the consequences of disaster is what?
Well, one of the things that I hear people say in jest, but you have to know that there's going to be an element of truth to this or behind this if ever, and I shouldn't say if ever, but when the United States sees a Fukushima or an earthquake. It's just, in my opinion, it's just inevitable that at some point there are professionals right now that are shocked that we have not seen a follow-up terrorist attack delivered successfully since 9/11.
I hear you.
And it's not that they haven't tried, but thank God for those brilliant men and women in the CIA and the FBI that are working, all those unsung heroes that we don't know about that have prevented these attacks. But inevitably, at some point, we could be facing a very catastrophic, very frightening type event. And it's one of those situations where the stuff that you and I are talking about may not feel as irrelevant. And one of the trends that we've seen, and I shared this in the last broadcast, so I won't repeat myself at length like I did in the first broadcast, but one of the things I would emphasize, if this is the only broadcast your listeners have managed to plug into and they missed the first one, is very shortly one of the trends we've seen in the survival industry, and this is larger than just Survivor Mall. This is long-term storage food manufacturers, emergency food ration manufacturers, water purification, purifier element manufacturers, and that is this. Following 9/11, following Hurricane Katrina, and following Fukushima, which wasn't even in the United States, mass panic-driven national demand created 3-month to 6-month back orders on these products in one day. It's so not to spread fear. I'm not here to frighten anyone, but there is a lot of wisdom to being very proactive with your preparation. If you have a family that you feel that you're responsible for, right now is the time to be thinking about, whether you would shelter in place. Maybe you need a grab-and-go bag. What would your plan be if you needed to evacuate? Where would you go? Where would be a safe place? Do you have a relative? These are things that if people wait until that day, the headlines, you're one of the multitudes of people that are not prepared, who are all scrambling to try to find the same products the same day. And unless you're in the first 1% of people that try to order this stuff online, you're not going to get anything until weeks after you needed it.
Absolutely.
So you asked me about stun guns, pepper sprays. People get excited what to do. One of the things that we've heard said in jest is people in the survival preparedness, and of course they're being sarcastic, but we've heard people say things, ridiculous things at preparedness expos where we've been presenting for Survivor Mall, where people have said, I don't need to be prepared. My plan is to take from the weak. Or take from those that have something. My preparedness plan is I've got a unregistered 12-gauge shotgun I'm planning to take from my neighbor. Well, these are obviously statements that are made in public in jest. Nobody that I know that said anything like this means it, but the idea that there will be those that's going to be their reaction. And if you've done your diligent homework and put away some storage food, some long-term storage food, you have, let's say first aid supplies, a way to purify water, sealed water, and anybody knows it or is willing to take the chance that they assume you do, and it is full crisis mode. Don't forget what happened in California after the Rodney King trial. Absolutely. I mean, that went ballistic in 24 hours. store owners were defending their stores with full live, 45 semi-automatic hand pistols and stuff.
Well, I'm a man of faith, and I don't preach or practice violence, but I also believe that we need to protect our families, and I believe that's really the impetus behind, a stun gun I've given my wife pepper spray and told her how to use it.
Sure.
In case she had a situation where she would need to defend herself. Why? Because I love my wife. I care for her. I would do anything I can to protect my wife and or children from harm. And of course, we're talking about a disaster, people on the streets, unprepared, trying to steal or take. Hey, if I have and set aside and prepare, I'm able to help others as well as my own. But I have to be willing to protect my family. And I believe that's why we have. I've heard people make comments over time, and of course what was mentioned during the last presidential election, right-wing Christians were called, people who relied on God, guns, and bullets, So there is it's a little raw area to touch on, but we do have to prepare for whatever eventuality may or may not come. We need to be prepared, and that's really what this broadcast is about. That's why we're talking about these subjects here on the show, and I don't advocate everyone going out and grabbing a gun, and particularly if you don't know how to use one, you ought not have one. You should.
Well, one of the things too that's really nice, Pastor Jerry, about pepper spray in particularly, is that it's non-lethal. And one of the things we've seen in the preparedness type industry is people unwilling to use a gun. They're afraid to use them. They're not sure if they could actually do something with a weapon of that magnitude if their life was being threatened. They question their own ability to take someone else's life if push comes to shove. But ironically,
they're the type of person obviously should not have one.
Should probably not have a gun, because if that, let's say your intruder or your, the person that's going to try and rob from you or hurt somebody in your family came in with a knife.
We would use it.
Well, you raised the bar to a gun but can't use it. Now he's got more lethal power than he had, and it escalates. Exactly. It escalates adrenaline. It escalates the whole situation unless you're trained and of the right mindset to know how to use it. But a pepper spray, ironically, those very same people statistically do not have a problem discharging pepper spray into the face of someone they feel is threatening their lives. And let me tell you from experience, anybody that questions the potency of being shot in the face with pepper spray has never been shot in the face with pepper spray. We have Streetwise pepper spray, and whilst a demonstration at an expo one time, outdoors, mind you, I was showing one of the staff at Survivor Mall how to appropriately discharge one of the ranged pepper sprays that we have. We have pepper sprays that spray almost like a super soaker. You see these kids running around with squirt guns. You shoot 20 feet in an accurate stream.
Nice.
Unlike a stun gun where you're required to be up within arm's grabbing reach of your attacker or whatever, a pepper spray, you can literally be running away from somebody and discharging it at 6 to 20 feet. I shot a target 6 feet away from where I was standing, and just because we were outdoors, just the vapors of the air carried some of just the vapors, just the fumes into my left eye. And I thought I was never going to, for about 10 minutes, I wasn't sure if I was ever going to see again out of that eye. And it was just the vapors. The wind had picked up some of the vapors and kind of brought it into my left eye, and I immediately dropped what I was doing. I ran inside. I flushed my face off for about 15 minutes, and I said to myself, I'm not even sure how you would breathe if somebody gave you a direct face discharge of this. So it's
effective in doing what it's designed to do, and that's immobilize you.
Oh, absolutely.
Completely.
And a lot of people are comfortable with them. They're non life threatening.
Well, that's
and so it gives a lot of women and a lot of people that are not comfortable the idea of actually using a life-taking weapon or a gun, something like that. It gives them a really nice, comfortable alternative, but very potent, very powerful, very effective.
You've answered my question very well there then, Joe. And I appreciate that because, I appreciate all that you've been sharing with us here in this broadcast. And we've run out of time for this show, but
sure.
Joe, thanks so much for being with us and sharing your valuable knowledge with our listeners.
You bet. I sure appreciate the opportunity. I hope that your listeners take something away from this broadcast and the last broadcast that benefits them in their pursuit to be prepared. And again, at www.survivormall.com, there's a lot of information on products as well as some free downloadable information that we want you to have. It's on a link on the left-hand side. It's free. Go get it.
You heard it here, ladies and gentlemen, www.survivormall.com. And I encourage all of our listeners to patronize this wonderful organization. If you can't find it, they can find it for you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we appreciate you being with us. And until next week, may the Lord bless you.
Thank you for listening to our broadcast. Pastor Jerry welcomes your correspondence. You can email your comments, questions, and prayer requests to him at lowercase jcarrickzilla@gmail.com. That's jcarrickzilla@gmail.com. Until our next broadcast, we'll see you there or in the air.